The fourth component of aggregate expenditure is net exports. Net exports, defined as exports minus imports, could be positive, negative, or equal to zero. Exports refer to the fact that some of the goods and services that Canadian firms produce are sold to other countries, for example, the US. Americans, Chinese, Europeans could be buying Canadian stuff, and therefore we can think of this, our exports, as being foreign consumption, foreign investment, foreign government spending that are spent on Canadian goods and services produced in Canada. Hence, this is a fourth group of buyers of Canadian stuff. Remember from before that we said consumption, investments, government expenditure. When we buy goods and services, we can also import from abroad. However, if we import some goods and services from abroad, these are not produced within Canada because we are looking at gross domestic products. We need to subtract the imported components from C, I, and G in order to reflect what is being produced within Canada as gross domestic product. And hence, that's why we subtract them. If a country has net export that is negative, which means the amount of money that we earn from exports versus the amount of money we have to pay because of imports, the difference is less than zero, which means this amount is not enough to cover this, and this means we must be a borrower. What we spend is bigger than what we earn from selling. In this case, we also tend to call this country as having a trade deficit. A second possibility, NX, is positive, which means the amount of money that we earn from selling stuff abroad versus the amount of money that we have to pay because we import. This is the sign. If that is the case, we have money left over from what we earn versus what we need to pay. We say that this country has a trade surplus. In the very odd case, suppose a country has export revenue to be exactly equal to import expenditure, then we say that this country has a trade balance. What about Canada? On average, are we a borrower or are we a lender? Do we have trade deficit or trade surplus if you look at the past 10 to 20 year average? If you look at the average, we tend to have net export to be a positive small number, around 2% of GDP, which means on average, we do run a trade surplus. Mostly with which country though? Probably no surprise. Most of our imports, exports are with the US. About 75% of what we export go to the US. About 55–60% of what we import are also coming from the US. On average, Canada runs a small trade surplus, but there is an exception. In 2008 to 2011, for these few years, we actually ran a small, very small trade deficit. Trade deficit less than 1% of GDP. The main reason, which means the amount of money that we can earn from exports dropped quite a bit. Imports, because we went through a recession, we also start to import less. However, the first effect dominates, and altogether, we actually have a trade deficit for these few years. What was the main reason? Because most of our exports go to the US. US had a recession in this time period. As a result, because our consumers, our main buyers of our exports, was not doing too well, that is why our export revenue dropped significantly. Let us summarize what we have just done. The aggregate expenditure approach to measuring GDP says that whatever amount of GDP that we produce, we can look at this as the supply side. We can also look at this from the demand side or the expenditure side. Who do the buying? Private consumers like you and myself, private firms like Concordia, government sector, and net exports. Altogether, we call this total expenditure, total spending, or the demand side, the spending side. This approach to measuring GDP is very convenient, especially for chapters to come. For example, for whatever reason, suppose consumer spending drops because consumers are more pessimistic about the future, their fear of losing their jobs. Firms, seeing that consumers spend less, they don't want to increase their spending on building, for example, more campuses such as Concordia or Second Cup, more shops. Investment expenditure also drop. This would lead to a recession. Why will be dropping? Right away we can tell what can the government do in order to prevent or lessen the damage of this recession. This means maybe the government sector can increase and try to a certain extent offset some of this drop in private expenditure. Or our exports start to drop because the US is going into a recession. What can we do? Once again, if export is dropping, what we can also try to do is the government sector can also increase spending and try to offset fully or partially the drop in production, spending, and therefore try to lessen this recession and try to keep GDP constant if possible.